John Wayne Gacy, the legend himself, known to kill more people than anyone in U.S. history.
Tonight on Crime Stories, he dressed like a clown to make children laugh. But behind the face paint was a man who tortured and murdered. He was John Wayne Gacy.
Who was John Wayne Gacy? He was an American serial killer and rapist who took the lives of at least 33 young males in Cook, Illinois, burying most of them under his house. Other bodies were received and recovered from the nearby Des Plaines River.
One of the most horrible crimes, perhaps, in a century.
He claimed to be a loving father.
See, I don't believe in hitting children.
But what he did to his young victims was unspeakable.
It was terrible. The smell of death was everywhere.
How he killed those boys for his own pleasures. How could you forgive him?
To the end, John Wayne Gacy proclaimed his innocence.
Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord, because you will have executed somebody that did commit the crime.
Sometimes known for his habit of dressing in a clown costume and makeup, Gacy had an abusive childhood and struggled with his homosexuality. After being convicted of sexual assault in 1968, Gacy's murders were discovered.
This is Crime Stories. I'm Richard Belvin. Imagine a nightmare. Your child is missing and you don't know what happened. Until one day a horrifying discovery. Your lost child is found, brutally murdered and buried in the basement of a man who was addicted to killing. The nightmare comes true not once or twice, but 33 times. The work of a man whose name became synonymous with evil. John Wayne Gacy, one of the most notorious serial killers of all time.
His early life. Gacy was born on March 17, 1942, in Chicago, Illinois. The son of Danish and Polish parents, Gacy and his siblings grew up with an alcoholic father who would beat the children with a razor strap if they were perceived to be misbehaved. His father physically assaulted Gacy's mother as well. Gacy's sister Karen would later say that the siblings learned to toughen up against the beatings, and that Gacy would not cry. Gacy suffered further alienation at school, unable to play with other children due to a congenital heart condition that was looked upon by his father as another failing. They later recognized that he was attracted to men and experienced great turmoil over his sexuality.
Spring 1992. Killer John Wayne Gacy tries to rewrite history.
When they paint the image that I was this monster who picked up like these altar boys along the street and swatted them like flies, I said, this is ludicrous.
The prison interview came 13 years after Gacy had been convicted of murdering 33 young men and boys from 1972 until 1978.
Whether it's Berkowitz, whether it's Bundy, whether it's Williams, Wayne Williams down in Atlanta, or any of the others, or Charlie Manson. See, I don't comment about other cases for the simple fact is that I wasn't there.
I feel somewhat of a kinship with some of those people.
God, I hate that when they put me in the same club with them.
Career, wife, and kids. Gacy worked as a fast food chain manager during the 1960s and became a self-made building contractor and Democrat precinct captain in the Chicago suburbs in the 1970s. Well-liked in his community, Gacy organized cultural gatherings and was active in the political organization in the JC Civic Group. He was murdered. Apparently, I wrote this down wrong. Like he was murdered and divorced twice and had a biological child. Yeah, I'm doing great. Oh my goodness. Okay. That makes me laugh so much. But he was divorced twice and had two biological children in addition to two stepdaughters. Oh, excuse me while I go laugh myself into a hole.
In 1992, in his television interview from prison, John Gacy presented himself to the public as a man deeply concerned with the breakdown of family values.
He realized by 1993 that 50% of the American families will be single-parented, and that shows a breakdown in the church and not being able to hold families together. And for this reason, children run away from home and seek love in other places.
Twice divorced himself, he still claimed to live his own life according to very strict standards.
I've always looked after my children, even now. A lot of things that my dad did, I refuse to do because I don't believe in hitting children.
A good father, a concerned citizen. He said he was also a dedicated community servant.
I always felt that service, community, and community service to others, you know, in my religious background, I felt if you serve other people, it'll come back to serve you.
Ironically, for people who knew Gacy before his arrest, his statements were actually believable because the public life of John Gacy was that of a model citizen and loving father. As the bodies, one after another, were pulled from Gacy's house in December 1978, there was no group more stunned than the group of people who considered themselves Gacy's friends.
I still find it hard to believe him. I've known the man 4.5 years, and I thought the world of him.
To those who knew him, John Gacy was not only a successful businessman, he was also a good neighbor. Routinely, he opened his house for lavish holiday theme parties. But what many remembered about him most was that he often dressed up as a clown to entertain children.
Gacy was a member of the Chicago area Jolly Joker Clown Club and frequently performed in a clown attire and makeup at children's fundraisers and other events as his alter ego Pogo the Clown or Patches the Clown. The killer clown sometimes lured his victims with the promise of construction work or some other rouge, and then captured and sexually assaulted, tormented, and eventually strangled most of them with his hands or with a rope. Years later, during a conversation with detectives while he was under surveillance, Gacy discussed his work as a clown, remarking, "Clowns can get away with murder."
In his house were staggering. He talked in detail about sexually abusing the boys and strangling them. As Gacy talked, the officers looked for some feeling in him, some emotion about what he'd done. There was none.
In the confession room, I most clearly remember that there was no remorse. Very, very cold about it.
By the
In 1968, Gacy was convicted of sexually assaulting 2 teen boys and given a 10-year prison sentence. He was released on parole in the summer of 1970, but was arrested again the following year after another teen accused Gacy of sexual assault. The charges are dropped when the boy didn't appear during the trial. By the middle of the 1970s, 2 more young males accused Gacy of rape, and he would be questioned by the police about the disappearance of others. Gacy referred to this period of his life as his cruising years, when he committed most of his murders.
police investigators entered Gacy's home, it was fastidiously neat. They collected an assortment of items: handcuffs, garter belts. One officer picked up a photo receipt from Nissan Pharmacy. But of all the items found, one of the most chilling was a class ring. It was quickly learned that the ring belonged to a recent high school graduate named John Zick, who, like Rob Beast, was missing. It was just the beginning. Through interviews with Gacy's acquaintances, it was discovered that 2 employees of Gacy's were also missing: Gregory Godzik and Johnny Budkovich, both 17 years old. Both had not been heard from for at least 2 years. An unmistakable pattern began to emerge.
On December 11, 1978, 15-year-old Robert Peist went missing. It was reported to police that the boy was last seen by his mother at a drugstore where he worked before he headed out to meet Gacy to discuss a potential construction job.
That didn't come together until December 1978, when a 15-year-old boy disappeared. He was one of a number of boys who had disappeared in the Chicago area, but something about him was different. The boy was Rob Peist, a sophomore in high school who worked part-time at the Nissan pharmacy in the northwestern suburbs of Chicago. On December 11th, at quitting time, he told his mother he was going to talk to a man about a construction job, but Rob Peist never made it home. His parents finally ended up at the police department to fill out a missing persons report on their youngest son.
There's a couple that was here last night reporting their son missing, and I think there's something strange to it. I don't believe that he's a runaway.
Sullivan agreed. Rob Peist was the consummate good kid, devoted to his family, an honor student who wanted to be an astronaut. There was no reason for him to run away. His parents were devastated.
I went to pick up Rob at the drugstore where he works about 10 to 9. And he says it would take a few minutes, but he wanted to talk to his contractor about a job. And with that, I started browsing around the store, and I've never seen him since.
For police, the most obvious lead was the contractor Rob had gone to meet.
Ten days later, a policeman searched Gacy's house in Norwood Park, Illinois, uncovered evidence of his involvement in numerous crimes, including murder. It was later discovered that Gacy had committed his first known killing in 1972, taking the life of 16-year-old Timothy McCoy after luring youth to his home after a lengthy period of police surveillance and investigation and the discovery of several trenches filled with human remains in the crawl space beneath his house. Gacy eventually confessed to killing about 30 people.
Was John Gacy. As it turned out, Gacy often hired young boys. 2 days after Rob disappeared, Sullivan called Gacy into the police station.
And he basically just said he had no idea what we were talking about. He denied even knowing the kid, and in frustration, I had said to him that, well, I understand that you don't want to say anything, but we've got evidence that, in fact, you were seen with him very recently.
Soon after that confrontation in mid-December 1978, police began tracking the movements of John Wayne Gacy. Meantime, a simple background check revealed that Gacy had been convicted 10 years earlier in Iowa.
Okay, here we go. Over the years, there has been lingering concerns that Gacy may have been responsible for the deaths of other people whose bodies have yet to be found. When police uncovered human remains in Gacy's house in 1978, 8 bodies could not be identified. More recently, Cook County authorities used DNA evidence to identify Gacy's unidentified victims in 2017. One of those men, victim number 24, was identified as 16-year-old James Jimmy Byron Higginson. In 1976, Higginson left his home in South Paul, Minnesota, and traveled to Chicago to begin the life in the city. On August 5th, he called his mother to let her know he had arrived. However, the police believe Gacy killed him shortly thereafter.
The victim, a teenage boy. Gacy was released from the Iowa Men's Reformatory after serving only 18 months. Because of Gacy's record, a 24-hour surveillance was ordered. David Hackmeister Lannister, then a 6-year veteran of the department and a young father of 3, was assigned to the job.
I knew that, in fact, they thought that this could be a homicide. They asked me to keep surveillance on the house.
It soon became obvious that a concealed surveillance of John Gacy would be impossible. Gacy often drove over 60 through city streets. Over several days, frustration grew as two-man teams followed Gacy on fruitless journeys throughout metropolitan Chicago.
His personality could change in a split second. You know, one second we're his best buddy, we're his bodyguards that he's introducing us people to, and the next second we'll go into another bar and we're from the FBI, we're harassing him.
As the days went on, there was still no sign of Rob Peast. His family posted his picture throughout the neighborhood. Then, a lead. Gacy told the surveillance team that he owned some land up north in Wisconsin.
So right away we're thinking that's where the body is. Of course, he's feeding us this information knowing that we're going to follow up on this, just kind of leading us off the track.
Work at the state's attorney's office was more productive. The investigators had obtained a search warrant for Gacy's house, based on Gacy's sodomy. The most chilling were those he made about his victims and their families. His contempt for them was obvious.
That one mother that gets on television all the time who thinks I should be given 33 injections. I think she ought to take 33 Valiums and go lay down. She goes on her own little show and all these other shows talking about, I think it's Maori, I think is the name. Her Marine son. Her Marine son, if her Marine son was so great, what the hell did he run away from home 12 times?
From the beginning, Gacy's victims were known as numbers and represented nothing more than the sequence in which they had been found. From the crawl space, they were taken to the county morgue, where the real work began, the job of identifying each body, changing the number to a name. The first body found turned out to be 17-year-old Johnny Butkovich, one of the boys who had worked for Gacy. The second was Greg Godzik, also an employee. As each name was announced: Darrell Sampson, John Zick, Randall Reffitt. The faces filled the newspapers. Body number 13 was Johnny Maori, 19 years old, a former Marine. His mother, Dolores Nieder, last saw Johnny on September 15, 1977.
We would go out searching for him. We were playing detectives. We were searching for Johnny, looking for him. And already, Johnny was dead.
As more bodies were identified, the names kept coming. William Carroll, Robert Gilroy, Russell Nelson. They were all young, healthy, strong. How had Gacy met boys? The answer:
Gacy was convicted of the sodomy of a teenage boy in Waterloo, Iowa in 1968 and was sentenced to 10 years imprisonment, but served 18 months. He murdered his first victim in 1972. He had murdered twice before that, but by the end of 1975, and murdered at least 30 subsequent victims after his divorce from his second wife in 1976. The investigation into the disappearance of Des Plaines teenager, which was from the story earlier, Robert, I do believe, Robert Peist. Yeah, I do believe that's his name. But yeah.
A bridge over the Des Plaines River. Eventually, 4 more bodies were recovered. The last one, found in the spring, was Rob Peast, the boy whose disappearance had led police to Gacy. Gacy to missing boys.
So it was as if a trickle had started and now all of a sudden it's turned into a waterfall.
It was then that the investigators got 2 final breaks. First, a fellow employee of Rob Peast revealed that she had put her photo receipt in Peast's jacket. That receipt was the same one found in Gacy's house. It provided a critical link, proving that John Gacy had contact with Rob Peast the night Rob disappeared. And there was more. Interviews with Gacy's employees revealed they had been asked by Gacy to dig trenches for new plumbing in the crawl space beneath the house. The story triggered a memory for a detective who had once used the bathroom in Gacy's house.
Mind you, again, it's cold winter, and the furnace came up from bringing the fumes up from downstairs. Now, being an experienced homicide detective, and Detective Schultz came back and said that he recognized the odor of bodies decaying.
Bodies in the basement.
On the evening of December 20th, Gacy drove to his lawyer's office in Park Ridge to attend a scheduled meeting, ostensibly to discuss the progress of his civil suit. On his arrival, Gacy appeared disheveled, my bad. That's a weird word, disheveled? Okay, whatever. Moving on. To discuss his progress of his civil suit. Sorry my chair is so squeaky. On his arrival, Gacy appeared disheveled and mainly asked for alcohol to drink. Whereupon Sam Emirati fetched a bottle of whiskey from his car. On his return, Emirati asked Gacy what he had to discuss with him. Gacy picked up a copy of the Daily Herald from Armity's desk, pointed to the front page article covering the disappearance of Robert Pice, and said, "This boy is dead. He's dead. He's in the river." Okay. Gacy then proceeded to give a rambling confession that ran into the early hours of the following morning. He began by informing Emirati and Stevens he had been the judge, jury, and executioner of many people, and that he now wanted them to have the same for himself. He said he buried most of his victims in his crawl space and had disposed of 5 other bodies in Des Plaines River. Gacy dismissed his victims as male prostitutes, hustlers, and liars, and to whom he gave the rope trick. Added he sometimes awoke to find dead, strangled kids on the floor with their hands cuffed behind their back. He had buried the bodies in his crawl space as he believed they were his property. As a result of the alcohol he had consumed, Gacy fell asleep midway through his confession. Emirati immediately arranged a psychiatric appointment for Gacy at 9 a.m. that morning. On awakening several hours later, Gacy shook his head and was informed by Emery he had confessed to killing approximately 30 people, saying, "Well, I can't think about this right now. I got things to do." Ignoring his lawyer advice regarding his scheduled appointment, Gacy left their office to attend to the needs of his business. Sorry about the yelling. My 5-year-old decides he has to have it his way or it's the highway and you get yelled at. No. No, thank you. Okay. Gacy then drove to the home of fellow contractor and friend Ronald Rode. Gacy hugged Rode before bursting into tears and saying, "I've been a bad boy." I'm sorry. Oh, I cracked myself up. I'm sorry. I had to. I killed 30 people, give or take a few. Gacy left Rhodes and drove to Cram's home to meet with Cram and Rosie. As he drove along the expressway, the surveillance officers noted that he was holding a rosary to his chin, praying while he drove. Gacy later recollected his memories of his final day of freedom as being hazy, adding he knew his arrest was inevitable and that he intended to visit his friends and say his final farewells. After leaving his lawyer's office, Gacy drove down to the gas station where, in the course of filing his rental card, he handed a small bag of cannabis to the attendant, who immediately handed the bag to the surveillance officers, adding that Gacy had told them, "The end is coming for me. These guys are going to kill me." After talking with Cram and Rosie, Gacy had Cram drive him to a scheduled meeting with lawyer Leroy Stevens. As Gacy spoke with him, Cram informed the surveillance officers that Gacy had told him and Rosie that he had confessed to over 30 murders with his lawyers the previous evening. Gacy then had Cram drive him to Mary Hill Cemetery. That's what we're doing today. Where his father was buried. As Gacy drove to various locations that morning, police outlined the formal draft of their second search warrant, specifically to search for the body of Robert Peist in a crawl space. On hearing from surveillance detectives that, in light of his erratic behavior, Gacy may be about to commit suicide, police decided to arrest him on a chance of possession and distribution of cannabis in order to hold him in custody. As a formal request for a second search warrant was presented. At 4:30 p.m. on December 21st, the evening of the hearing of Gacy's civil suit, Judge Marvin J. Peters granted the request for a second search warrant. After police informed Gacy of their intention to search his crawl space for the body of Peist, Gacy denied the teenager was buried there, but confessed to have killing a young man in self-defense and whose body was buried under his garage. Armed with the signed search warrant, police and evidence technicians drove to Gacy's home. On their arrival, officers found Gacy had unplugged his sump pump, flooding the crawl space with water to clear it. They simply replaced the plug and waited for the water to drain. After it had done so, evidence technician Daniel Ginty entered the 28 by 38 foot crawl space, crawled to the southwest area, and began digging. Within minutes, he had uncovered putrefied flesh and human arm bone. Gently immediately shouted to the investigators that they could charge Gacy with murder, adding, "I think this place is full of kids." A police photographer then dug in the northeast corner of the crawl space, uncovering a patella. The two then began digging in the southeast corner, uncovering 2 lower leg bones. The victims were too decomposed to be Peist, as a body discovered in the northeast corner was later unearthed. A crime scene technician discovered the skull of the second victim alongside this body. Later, excavations of the feet of this second victim relieved a further skull beneath the body. Because of this, technicians returned to the trench where the first body was unearthed, discovering the ribcage of a fourth victim within the crawl space, confirming the scale of murders.
He was connected to several missing boys, but not a single body had been found. As Gacy was led into the station, a second search of his house was just moments away. When Crime Stories continues, he had an answer for everything. Even when he was asked about the odor from the crawl space, Gacy had an explanation.
I found it as odd when we bought the house that a house with a crawl space would need a sump pump. But then I learned the first time it rained that this ground gets wet under there, and the crawl space actually floods up to a foot deep in water. And then as it recedes, it puts out a musty odor. There was always a musty odor in that house.
As for the day in December 1978, when a police detective thought he smelled decaying bodies, Gacy said it wasn't that at all.
We had come into the house, and my little Lhasa Apso was in the house. And of course, he had been locked in the kitchen, all day. Well, the little puppy, he piddles, see, and while he's piddling, and while he is doing his business on the paper and that, you can imagine what it smells like if you go into a closed room. And when the heat came on.
Still today, it seems inconceivable that Gacy would rely on such a defense. Because the truth about the crawl space became international news on the very day Gacy was arrested. On the night of December 21st, 1978, while John Gacy was held at the Des Plaines police station for possession of marijuana, the second search of his house began. While some officers looked for evidence upstairs, 2 went below into the crawl space. Moving on hands and knees, the evidence technicians surveyed the muddy ground. One officer took a shovel, dug down about 6 inches, and pulled up something hard. It was a human bone. While held at a local police station, Gacy complained of chest pains and was rushed to a nearby hospital. Detective David Hackmeister met him there.
I hadn't been there maybe 20 minutes or half an hour when I got a phone call from my supervisor advising that they had found bones in the crawl space. At that time, Gacy was just being released from Holy Family Hospital, and I advised him at that point that he was under arrest for murder.
Gacy was brought to trial on February 6, 1980, charged with 33 murders. He was tried in Cook County, Illinois before Judge Louis Garpipo. I don't know, I like Garpipo better. The jury was selected from Rockford because of significant press coverage in Cook County. At the request of his defense counsel, Gacy spent over 300 hours with doctors in a year before his trial. He underwent a variety of psychological tests before a panel of psychiatrists to determine whether he was mentally competent to stand trial. Gacy attempted to convince the doctor that he had multiple personality disorder. He claimed to have 4 personalities: the hardworking, civic-minded contractor, the clown, the active politician, and the policeman called Jack Hanley, who he referred to as Bad Jack. When Gacy had confessed to police, he claimed to be relaying the crimes of Jack, who dissented homosexuality and viewed male prostitutes as weak, stupid, and degrading scum. His lawyers opted to have Gacy plead not guilty by reason of insanity to the charges against him. Presenting Gacy as a Jekyll and Hyde character, the defense preceded several psychiatric experts who had examined Gacy. 3 psychiatric experts at Gacy's trial testified they found him to be paranoid schizophrenic with multiple personalities. The prosecutors presented the case that Gacy was sane and in full control of his actions. On February 18th, Robert Stein testified that all the bodies recovered from Gacy's property were remarkable, decomposing, and petrified skeleton remains, and that all the autopsies he performed, 3 victims had died of asphyxiation, 6 of legal strangulation, and 1 multiple stab wounds to the chest, and 10 in underdetermined ways. When Gacy's defense team suggested that all 33 deaths were caused by accidental erotic asphyxiation, Stein called his highly impossible. On February 29, Donald Voorhees, whom Gacy sexually assaulted in 1967, testified to his ordeal at Gacy's hands and his subsequent attempts to assault him. From testifying by paying others used to spray mace in his face and beat him. Voorhees felt unable to testify but did briefly attempt to do so before asking to step down. During the 5th week of the trial, Gacy wrote a personal letter to Judge Guapipo requesting a mistrial for a number of reasons, including that he did not approve of his lawyer's insanity plea, that his lawyers had not allowed him to take the witness stand as he wanted to, that his defense had not called enough medical witnesses, and the police were lying with regarding to verbal statements he had perpetually made to detective after his arrest, and that in any event the statements were self-serving for use by the prosecution. Judge Guapipo addressed Gacy's letter by informing him that both counsels had been denied the opportunity or funds to summon expert witnesses to testify, and that under the law he had the choice whether he wished to testify and was free to indicate as much to the judge as he wished to do so.
Defeated, Gacy looked straight at Hackmeister and said, "Dave, I'm ready to clear the air." He then confessed to the murder of more than 30 young men and boys.
He certainly held nothing back. He talked about the very first person that he killed, and that he had stabbed him to death, and that caused such a mess that he had to come up with another plan after that. Every person that he killed thereafter, he came up with a plan to strangle.
The specifics Gacy
The closing arguments. March 11th, final arguments by both prosecutor and defense attorneys began. They concluded the following day. Prosecuting attorney Terry Sullivan spoke first, outlining Gacy's history of abusing youth, the testimony of his effort to avoid detecting and describing his surviving victims, Voorhees and Donnelly, as living dead zombies. Run! Referring to Gacy as the worst of all murderers, Sullivan stated, John Gacy has accounted for more human devastation than many earthly catastrophes, but one must tremble. I trembled when thinking about just how close he came to getting away with it all. After the state's 4-hour closing, counsel Sami Emirati spoke for defense. Emirati argued against the testimony delivered by the doctors who had testified for the prosecution, repeatedly citing the testimony of 4 psychiatrists and psychologists who had testified on behalf of the defense. The jury deliberated for less than 2.5 hours and found Gacy guilty of 33 charges of murder. He was also found guilty of sexual assault and taking indecent liberties with a child. Both convictions in reference to Robert Heist. At the time, he had been convicted for 33 murders, which was the most for any person in U.S. history that has been convicted.
The first body bag emerged. The crew pressed on. A second body was carried out shortly after. On that first day, a ritual was established that would last as long as the digging continued. Each afternoon, Dr. Stein would report the discoveries of the day.
In the garage, there was just one skeletalized remain, and in the house itself also a skeletalized remain.
No one knew how many bodies would eventually be found, but based on Gacy's confession, officials speculated that the number would be considerable.
When this whole thing's over, you might be witnessing one of the most horrible crimes, perhaps, in a century.
Early on, investigators who could provide the most help, John Gacy. He showed them one spot to check and then was quickly whisked away. Gacy's information about the graveyard beneath his house was remarkably precise. At one point, he even drew a sketch of the crawl space.
To this day, it's a bone-chilling little handwritten sketch because this guy knew where almost every body was. He didn't remember the names of them, or he wouldn't tell us the names, but he knew where they were in the base.
These bodies were essentially skeletalized.
For those working in the crawl space, the job was horrendous. Each time they dug a hole, it would immediately fill with water. They would sort through the mud by hand, picking up small bones. When they found a skull, they placed a stake into the ground with an identifying number. Outside in the freezing cold, among the spectators, was veteran crime reporter John Drummond.
It attracted the curious, despite the cold weather. People would come out there to see the scene because what had the scene ever happened before? No. The odor was terrible. All the investigators that we talked to afterwards admitted that the stench, despite the fact it was very cold, the weather was overwhelming. It was terrible. The smell of death was everywhere they went in there.
Some people came not just out of curiosity. They were relatives of young men who were missing.
I just have a grandson missing, and it's just a stab in the dark.
The number of bodies found today are 6.
Bringing the total to
21.
In the final stages of the search, the Gacy house was completely dismantled. 29 bodies had been unearthed. But nowhere had they found Rob Peast, the young boy whose disappearance had initiated the investigation of John Wayne Gacy. The search for him would continue.
At this point in time, it would appear that we have removed both bodies from the crawl space.
As the search for bodies ended, there was one question the stunned public wanted answered. How had John Gacy gotten away with killing so many young men and boys for so many years? Behind the mask. In April 1979, John Gacy was indicted for the murder of 33 young men and boys, the largest number of murders ever charged to one person in U.S. history. Gacy's ploy to lure his victims. When we continue on
To top it all, I mean, he used to do a lot of this charitable work. In other words, the guy was a clown, and he put on shows and all that, and the kids there, he treated the kids real good and all that.
But now, with the bodies being pulled from his basement, the world discovered another side to John Gacy, and suddenly people wanted to know who was this Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Attorney Greg Adamski, who later represented Gacy, discovered Gacy operated by his own rules.
Most of the things that all of us value, John had no value for at all. John didn't value other life. John didn't value other emotions. John didn't value any institutions. John didn't value the feelings of other people.
John Gacy grew up in Chicago. His father was reportedly abusive, and he had some health problems as a child. He was close to his mother and only sister. In his adolescent years, Gacy loved to dress up in uniforms. He scored 118 on an IQ test, which is in the bright normal range. He told doctors after his arrest that he committed his first murder when he was 15 years old, and then couldn't stop. He made the statement in 1979 to the psychiatrist hired to help in his defense, Helen Morrison.
He started the pattern of what later is described as almost an addiction to homicide. And it's so...
Never charged with the murder he claimed to commit as a teen. And then in the 60s, he got married to a co-worker and went to work as a manager for a Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurant in Waterloo, Iowa. He became active in a local civic organization, the JCs, even named Man of the Year. Gacy had a young wife and children, but was developing a penchant for sex with young boys. In 1968, at age 26, he was convicted of sexually assaulting a teenage boy. He was sentenced to 10 years, but because he was such a model prisoner, he served only 18 months. Divorced, he made a clean start, rejected his family, and became involved in Democratic Party politics, and was even photographed with then First Lady Rosalind Carter. He also married a childhood friend who had 2 young daughters of her own. In the early 70s, he began a small contracting business called PDM, painting, decorating, and maintenance. Outwardly, Gacy maintained a life that appeared meticulously in order. But unusual stories about him occasionally surfaced, like this one from him. As John Gacy spoke from prison in 1992, he made it very clear that he was tired of being associated with other famous serial killers, especially the man who killed and then consumed his victims, Jeffrey Dahmer.
I'll tell you this, that's a good example as to why insanity does belong in the courtroom. Because if Jeffrey Dahmer doesn't meet the requirements for insanity, then I'd hate like hell to run into the guy that does.
It is an ironic statement, coming from a man who 13 years before had pled not guilty to 33 murders, using the defense of insanity. On February 6, 1980, the first day of John Gacy's trial, people lined up at the criminal court building in Chicago, eager to get a glimpse of one of the most notorious serial killers of all time. Already, Gacy's story had received so much press coverage in Chicago that jurors had to be selected from Rockford, a city 50 miles north. The 16 men and women were bused to the courthouse and sequestered for the entire 6-week-long trial. Gacy was pleading not guilty by reason of insanity. And at first, it seemed the defense had an advantage. The judge was Louis Garippo.
If you really think about it, if the defense is insanity, and you have someone who's killed 33 people, everyone say, hey, there must be something wrong with that person. And I believe that in most, more than half of the jurors that were selected felt that there was something mentally wrong with John Gacy.
In their opening statements, attorneys for the prosecution argued that Gacy was evil. They displayed photographs of his victims on a board, nicknamed the Gallery of Grief. The judge was Louis Garippo.
If you really think about it, if the defense is insanity, and you have someone who's killed 33 people, everyone say, hey, there must be something wrong with that person. And I believe that in most, more than half of the jurors that were selected felt that there was something mentally wrong with John Gacy.
In their opening statements, attorneys for the prosecution argued that Gacy was evil. They displayed photographs of his victims on a board, nicknamed the Gallery of Grief. They promised to show that the murders of the young men were thoughtful, rational, and premeditated. The defense described Gacy as impulsive, deranged, a profoundly sick man who collected bodies like souvenirs. The question the jury had to decide was Gacy crazy or evil? For the defense, a battery of experts testified was forensic psychiatrist Helen Morrison. Impulsive, deranged, a profoundly sick man who collected bodies like souvenirs. The question the jury had to decide was Gacy crazy or evil? For the defense, a battery of experts testified that Gacy fit the standard of insanity. One was forensic psychiatrist Helen Morrison.
He could commit an act, but it didn't mean that he sat and planned the act. It was almost as if he were an automaton doing this behavior, and once the behavior was done, he was finished.
The psychiatric experts offered varying opinions of Gacy's mental illness: borderline personality, paranoid schizophrenia, amnesia. But the prosecution believed the facts of the case were more important than the psychiatric testimony. If the murders were not premeditated, they asked, why would Gacy have burial trenches dug in advance? Why did he keep handcuffs and a rope ready? If he didn't understand the criminality of his behavior, why would he deliberately choose victims who might not be missed? If he had amnesia, how could he draw a precise sketch locating each body? William Kunkel was the chief prosecutor.
Clearly, when you have this kind of intentional behavior, the pre-planning for all those things, the covering up, the post-planning, the post-conduct for all those things, and all this going on in the backdrop of what on the surface appears to be a perfectly normal existence, just doesn't fit.
As the jury heard the testimony and looked at Gacy, they saw a man at ease, very much in control of himself.
The theory or the thought or the fantasy about someone who's insane is
Involved in politics and was active in his community. All rare accomplishments for someone truly mentally ill.
A real medical model psychiatrist that really treats patients and understands mental illness will never believe that you can turn this kind of serious mental illness off like a faucet. Did he have personality disorders? Absolutely. Was he a sexual deviant? Of course. But psychotic? Not even close.
He was found insane. He would be put out on the street because he could not be hospitalized against his will. That, obviously, no one in their right mind believed that this man was sane. But no one was willing to take the chance.
As ardent opponents of the death penalty, working together, they had taken on one of the most unpopular cases in the country.
First of all, we had death threats. We had clients who quit us. We carried the baseball bat from the garage to the house after a while. We had bomb threats.
Dozens of legal issues were raised on behalf of Gacy, while he maintained that he was not the one who killed the boys in his basement.
At the time of my arrest, there was 4 other suspects, all employees, and contractors, all with keys to.
Gacy denied his guilt.
I wanted him to have this breakthrough. I wanted him to have this all of a sudden, all right, there's no more pretense, there are no more appeals. Now I can tell you I did it, this is why I did it. I was waiting for it, but it came. It was like a book with no ending.
As the years went by, each and every appeal was denied. At last, a final execution date was set. Years went by, each and every appeal was denied. At last, a final execution date was set. May 10th, 1994, 14 years after his conviction.
There's nothing was going to delay the killing of Johnny Gacy because the people were bound and determined that Johnny Gacy was going to be killed.
Throughout the years on death row, Gacy claimed that he was not worried. He had no reason to fear the day he would die.
Do you believe you've lived your life the right way, then you do not have nothing to fear in my case?
You're not worried about facing God?
No. I'm fairly comfortable with him. I've been At the Catholic services, I'm the server for the priest for the last 10 years. I have no qualms about doing that.
On the morning of his execution, Gacy was flown from his downstate prison to the death chamber at Stateville Correctional Center.
We have attorneys on standby that will be available to the very end to fight any attempts to stay this execution.
By 7 that evening, the U.S. Supreme Court denied a last request for a stay of execution.
At the end, Gacy wanted to speak with each of the lawyers separately. He took me aside and he wanted to thank me for trying as hard as I could and for keeping him occupied with jokes and for being kind to him and calling him and keeping him informed.
Even while the crowds cheered outside his cell, Gacy did not believe he was going to die.
At about 11:15 on the night that Gacy was killed, one of us called up Gacy and said, "How are you doing?" Gacy said, "You know what? Can this wait? Can I talk to you a while?" He said, "No, John, I can't wait. I mean, what do you mean a while?" He said, "Call back in an hour or two." He said, "John, you're going to be dead in an hour or two. What are you thinking about?"
There was a candlelight vigil by opponents of the death penalty, but far more people clearly were in favor of his execution. Just after midnight, with relatives of his victims watching on a television in the prison basement, Gacy was strapped to a gurney in the execution room. He was given 3 lethal injections.
John Wayne Gacy was pronounced dead at 12:58 a.m.
He got a much easier death than any of his victims. In my opinion, he got an easier death than he deserved.